My grandmother was half Mexican, even though she always told us, oh, we're Spanish, right? We're not Mexican, right? I've never really researched that distinction. That was self-perception of my grandmother, right? So that made my grandmother half Native and half Hispanic. My mother then was a quarter, right? And myself and my siblings, right, are considered an eighth, right? So think about that. You have to fractionate your body, right, to determine who you are based upon these social constructs, right? And a lot of times, and I'll explain this in a little more detail in a couple of minutes, but the distortion of this application of blood quantum is you can take, say, a native man, and he marries a native woman, and this man is 1/4 Navajo, 1/4 Apache, 1/4 Havasupai, and 1/4 Pima, right? 4 different tribes in this lineage background, right? And he marries a native woman who's 1/4 Cheyenne, 1/4 Cherokee, 1/4 Lakota, and 1/4 Comanche, okay? And they have children, right? So these children, as a result of this bonding, become 1/8 of all these tribes, right? And despite that, you know, they're full bloods, right? 8/8 equals 1, right? They don't meet the percentage of any of these tribes, right? So what do we do about that population, right? You don't meet the blood quantum, right? So therefore, are you not a native person? Right? Again, this fragmented distinction of determining racial uniqueness in our country, right? Which again, as the book emphasized and as my examples show, race is a social concept, not a scientific one. Questions? Points of observation. So, you know, again, this distinction regarding, as our book discusses, the application of minority-majority as we've talked, gender discrimination, right? And if you look at population demographics right now, there's probably more women in the United States than men, right? But they're still considered a numerical minority to men, right? Despite being the numerical majority, right? Women given minority status even though they outnumber men, right? And is that distinction, you know, how do we base that situation, minority, majority, right? Is it based upon population demographics? No. Is it based upon power differentials, right? Well, our book emphasizes that it's power, okay? Say what? If you're gonna sleep, there's some nice chairs in the lobby, okay? But don't sleep in my classroom.
Okay.
Okay, so if you wanna go sleep, you can cruise into the lobby or you can listen. All right, so, so with that, you know, these distinctions regarding minority, majority, again, are a social construct, right? Demographers will tell us that current population trends, if they continue by the middle of this century, Latino, Hispanic populations will become the numerical majority, right? Is that gonna change the distinction of minority-majority applications, right? In correlation to racial distinctions in America. Questions, observations. Okay, so again, in that section, minority dominant group relations, There's several examples there. We talked about segregation, and it uses some of the examples that I emphasized on the board, right, such as South Africa and apartheid. Right? Again, there, African black populations being the numerical majority, but considered a minority based upon power differentials. And this extended, all the way into the 1990s until trade and economic boycotts against the country of South Africa and the iconic figure of Nelson Mandela being imprisoned for over 30 plus years when he was released in 1992, soon after apartheid as a systematic process in South Africa was disbanded. So when we look at these, our book uses the example of expulsion, and in that it emphasizes sociologically the process of forcibly removing people from one part of the country is referred to as expulsion. Native Americans populated broad swaths of North America when the first European settlers arrived. As U.S. settlement expanded westward, Native Americans were driven under military arms to march sometimes thousands of miles to areas designated by the government as Native American reservations. These reservations continue to be socially and economically marginal areas to this very day. Okay? This must be crazy. So, an example here again. Another section in chapter 1 emphasizes assimilation and cultural pluralism, along with expulsion, segregation, before we get into the theories, right? So one of the policies, again, another social construct as an example, regarding assimilation was federal Indian boarding schools that were initiated in the late 1800s as a result of a policy that said, kill the Indian and save the man. Okay? The whole process was assimilation, right? And again, under the institution and authority of the United States government. Under the policy implications that American Indians are to be equals of Euro-Americans, children to be immersed into mainstream America, guised upon the belief that Indians were a vanishing race, and they can save it with cultural transformation. In other words, assimilating to the values of mainstream society. So when we talk about assimilation, the absorption of a minority group into a dominant culture. So that was the goal here, right? And many times, populations in the United States and elsewhere have the misconception that American Indians receive federal services from the federal government because of our race. Well, race has a little bit to do with it, but it's largely these social constructs that were created in laws and policies impacting American Indians, such as the Constitution, right? Where it mentions American Indians specifically in the Commerce Clause and in treaty-making clauses under the United States Constitution, which made American Indians the only group, racial group, ethnic group, that was specifically mentioned in the original version of the United States Constitution. What makes American Indians unique as a population is that we're the only population that has treaties with the United States government. Approximately about 370, right? Furthermore, like with the case of the example of African Americans in the federal courts, right? Numerous acts of Congress specified certain specific outcomes for American Indians as a population group. Okay? The Removal Act of 1830 that is emphasized in that section of expulsion. So many tribes in the Southeast, particularly the Cherokees, Choctaws, Chickasaws, Creeks, and Seminoles, that are sometimes referred to as the 5 civilized tribes, were victims of expulsion by the federal government passing this congressional act in 1830 that called for the forced removal of these populations to an area the United States government created called Indian Territory, which is now the state of Oklahoma. So despite the fact that these populations, like the Cherokees, Choctaws, and others, had their existence in this part of the country for thousands of years, long before Europeans got here, Cherokees lived in this area of the world, right? But yet, a government can create a policy that tells you to leave. And with you, your cultural identity, right? I mean, many native people and tribes identify with the land, with the natural world, right? So the distinction of that identity, right, was also exposed when forced removal took place, right? In what we know as the Trail of Tears among the Cherokees, where over 4,000 Cherokee men, women, and children died in these forced death marches. So a lot of these acts of Congress, right, fractionated our land, created allotments on reservation. Now, this is an interesting social construct, right? The Aboriginal people of this country, Native Americans, weren't given citizenship until 1924, right? 4 years after women gained the right to vote and suffrage in 1920. And in states like the federal government said, okay, these Aboriginal people of our country will now become citizens like everybody else. And what actually stimulated the Citizenship Act was that many American Indian men participated in World War I, defending this country without even being citizens. Right? So we draw that correlation today to many immigrant populations that have served their country and still don't get the full beneficial rights of that service, right? Or even, our gay and lesbian populations who serve our country sometimes are discriminated against and don't get the full benefits of serving this country, right? So the Citizenship Act was kind of an afterthought, right? Another example of a social construct, right? And in states like Arizona, the states like the South weren't necessarily, in open arms accepting some of these policies. So in Arizona, Indians didn't get the right to vote in state elections until 1948, 24 years after becoming citizens of the nation, right? Arizona used the argument that, well, the Indians aren't necessarily citizens of Arizona, they're wards of the federal government. Right? And that prevented full participation in the political process for 24 years. We call a lot of these examples that I'm using this afternoon institutional discrimination or institutional racism. The Termination Act, the federal government created a law that said certain tribal groups would no longer be Indians anymore. Their reservations were taken back, their federal funding was taken back, their identity as Indians was taken away, they were made state citizens, right? And termination means just that, similar to removal, right? These people lost their identity to their Aboriginal homelands, to their culture, to their tradition, to their spirituality. These folks here lost their identity completely. Over 100 tribes terminated. Right? Many people ask, why is it that Indians can have initiatives like gaming and gambling on their reservations when it's illegal for everybody else, right? Like in Arizona, right? Because Congress said so, right? The Indian Gaming Regulatory Act. It's not like the Indians initiated this policy solely by themselves, right? They had the support of the federal government. So as you can see, right, this distinctive relationship that Indians have with the federal government is based upon these legal institutions, the constitutions, treaties, and acts of Congress. Right? Racial distinctions have a little bit to do with it, but not in its entirety. Right? And largely, American Indians receive these federal services for education, healthcare, infrastructure on the reservation, like housing, roads, public works, right? Having running water in your home, right? Electricity, the internet, right? It's largely because Indians ceded land in these treaties in exchange for peace and protection, right? So the federal government, right? If you look at the history of this country, right? This country was once all Indian land. And historically, over time, these policies and laws have created fragments in our land base, similar to the map you see in our book, right? That these little red dots on the land are the only remaining remnants of the land area that Indians once possessed, right? So in these treaties are agreements, right, that stipulate the federal government will provide education to American Indians as a result of ceding land in the Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1868 from time immemorial, for time immemorial, right? Which means basically forever. Right? Or articles in the treaty will say, we are going to provide health care for American Indians as a population because of the cessions of lands that were created through the treaty-making process. Right? And we're going to provide infrastructure to American Indians to exist as a population, right, because of the land they ceded to this country. Right? So, I think the federal government of the United States perceives these treaties as fair and just, but I don't think all those services equate to the amount of land that was basically stolen, right, as a result of these legal policies and legal institutions, right? Like with the history of African Americans, the Supreme Court also had a tremendous impact on this land area going from this to this, right? In cases like these. Involving the Cherokees challenging removal, right? The Cherokees challenging the jurisdiction of a state over individuals that live on Indian land, right? The Supreme Court determined that Indians don't have aboriginal title to these reservations. They only retain a right of occupancy. So like with that previous act, termination, occupancy is not true ownership. So when Congress intervened in the 1950s with the Termination Act, because those 100 tribes that were terminated only occupy the land, don't own it, was Congress's justification for termination, right? So depending on how you interpret the law, policy in our government, right? These are perfect examples of social construction within our society, within the impacts of policies like assimilation, right? And we saw the same processes, like I mentioned, when we're studying culture, with ethnic groups from distinct areas of the world coming to Ellis Island or coming to Angel Island in San Francisco. And the goal of immigration policy was all these immigrant groups would enter the melting pot and emerge Americans, right? Assimilation at one of its finest examples. And again, these social institutions, right, that impact the assimilation of Indians, right? In those boarding schools, right, this is the same dude, right, before and after. Right?
It's the same guy?
Same guy, right? And I'll show you some more pictures in just a second. But take the quote from Teddy Roosevelt, right, who was our president during that melting pot era, the turn of the century, when many immigrant populations were coming in. And he said this: "I don't go so far as to think that the only good Indians are dead Indians, but I believe 9 out of 10 are. And I shouldn't inquire too closely in the case of the 10th. The most vicious cowboy has more moral principle than the average Indian." President of the United States addressing a population in correlation to assimilation. And in these boarding schools, when they took the children, right, the total goal was to immerse them into American mainstream culture, American mainstream standards. And the best way to do that was to start with the children. And basically taking them from their traditional cultural foundations and instituting a process of assimilation, right, under a military model. Right? We talked about resocialization, right? These kids totally underwent forced involuntary resocialization, right? So that this individual from the Navajo reservation in Arizona is the same guy upon arriving at the Carlisle Indian School in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And again, many of the student population that were taken were elementary school age children, right? And these boarding schools were far removed from the homelands of these children. So if you have younger siblings, right, think about maybe your 6 or 7 or 8-year-old brother or sister being taken from your family for 9 months out of the year, and if your family could afford it, they'd come home in summer. If they couldn't, they'd stay at the boarding school, right? And having to live, in the capacity of psychologically understanding, right, that who you were wasn't the social standard of the day, right? Forced assimilation, right? And again, right, these young kids, right? The Haskell Indian Boarding School in Lawrence, Kansas, right? And some of the history of the boarding school legislation. Congress passed compulsory school attendance laws, which left families with little choice. In 1898, a law was passed to take children from their parents so they can place them in schools. Children were recruited to bring in other students without consent of the parents. There's a documented historical event in Arizona where 48 Hopi fathers up from northern Arizona were sent to Alcatraz prison in San Francisco because they refused to send their children to federal Indian boarding schools. So they were made an example of. So again, some of the impacts of assimilation on these small children that creates outcomes of historical trauma, intergenerational trauma, right? Many psychologists conclude today, social psychologists, that American Indians have the highest rates of suicide, as we saw in that chart, right, after white males. The highest rate of alcoholism, drug abuse, right? Poverty, low-level educational attainment, right? Intergenerational trauma is not something that goes away very easily, right? Especially differences among the reaction of the impacted population, right? Some of us are stronger than others, some of us weaker than others, some of us more emotionally passionate about issues we're confronted with, right? So you think about immigration policy today, where separating parents from children, right, in these detainment facilities, right? And some of these children being separated from their parents now going on like 2 years in some cases, some younger than 5 as they progress in age, right? It's something they're never gonna forget as long as they live. Right? That's another good example of historical trauma. A lot of these students died at these boarding schools. We have one of these federal Indian boarding schools downtown, or it's called Steele Indian School Park now, but it was the Phoenix Indian School. Right? And there's a burial ground on site. Many of them died of homesickness, right? Of diseases where they had very few immunities toward. Right? And again, the assimilation process was to emphasize a curriculum that emphasized, along with academics, even I think more strongly than academics, vocational training. Right? One of the outcomes of boarding school education was we'll teach them to be good servants. So these young girls learning gender roles, right, of dominant mainstream America. Right? One of the things that the children were introduced to during this time period was the concept of being introduced to institutional religion, right, where their spiritual, cultural, traditional-based knowledge was driven out of them, right? And largely, they put religious denominations on the board, and the children were told, choose one. Right? And, we have many Indian populations today that are numerous Christian denominations. Right? And it was all Christianity. Right? So we have Episcopalians, Baptists, Methodists, Catholics, right? Protestants, and numerous denominations. Right? The other thing they did at these boarding schools was change their names. Right? I think some of the most common names for American Indians are Johnson, Jones, Smith, and they all came from the boarding school, taking away Aboriginal names like Red Cloud, like Fire Thunder. Many of our names, our traditional names, reflect that connection with nature. But we had to get rid of that identity as well, right? So these were forced situations of assimilation, right? That had the population had very little choice, right? And you look at the immigrant population, as I was talking about earlier, right? And some of the social changes as a result of policies and laws that they had to undertake. Similarly, their names changed, right? Identities changed. They were sent to specific geographical areas that necessitated labor, right? Or some populations were allowed immigration to the United States to provide labor, like the Chinese who built the railroads, right? 2 years after the Transcontinental Railroad was complete, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act that took those same workers that built the railroads and deported them back to China, right? So, you know, as you know, historically, right, we like to ideally think about, you know, our nation state as equal, providing liberty and justice for all, but for certain populations and certain racial and ethnic groups, that process was a lot more difficult than for other populations. Right? But I think almost every ethnic and racial group has some form of negativity in our backgrounds that we faced, right, as a population because of these social constructs. As we've used gender discrimination as a clear-cut example. Right? As humans, right, women up until the late 1800s were considered property of their husbands if they were married. Right? And again, suffrage resulted in a greater degree of rights. Like the right to vote, the right to fully participate in the political process, right? That didn't occur until the 20th century for females, right? And even later for certain ethnic groups, as I exemplified in the lecture. Okay. So I'll post this to Canvas. Take a look at the assignment, and if it doesn't fit your situation, let me know, and I'll send you the alternative. Have a good weekend. We'll see you next week.